Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Napoleon in Egypt Part 4, Bonaparte Fails by Extra History. So last time we ended with the revolt of Cairo, and we also started setting up the idea that Napoleon might want to leave Egypt sometime soon, though we have a bit to go before we get to that point. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this reaction, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive, regular content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Cairo, October 23rd, 1798. It's the morning after the Cairo revolt, and the city still resists. French soldiers are storming the barricaded alleys, clearing them with musket volleys and cannons.
Yes, so we start off right at the end of the revolt of Cairo, and like I mentioned last time, Napoleon performed a pretty brutal cleanup of the remaining rebels. Of course, what we're talking about is a massacre of quite a few people. Really brutal, like I said, but also not entirely untypical of Napoleon. He could be magnanimous, and even in this expedition, he's tried to be magnanimous, but if he faced any serious resistance, Napoleon was not afraid to get his hands dirty.
The city reels, and the French count casualties. While Napoleon officially claims only 21 French have
No way, probably closer to a few hundred.
died, that's a bit laughable. The true number is around 300. Among them are a group of military engineers targeted for their role in attempting to reshape the city. Headless bodies float down the Nile.
Yeah, and there were a couple of pretty important subordinates that Napoleon lost during this revolt. The French lost a couple hundred soldiers that, at this point, they really can't afford to lose, and some pretty prominent subordinates, engineers, officers. You know, there were some pretty key deaths.
Executed rebels dumped there on Napoleon's orders. French soldiers dump out sacks of severed heads into Cairo's main square, and 6,000 rebels have died in what increasingly resembles a massacre. The sight makes some of Napoleon's officers sick.
I mean, that's exactly right. A couple thousand rebels killed, and I mean, look, well, there's the argument to make that Napoleon shouldn't be there in the first place. This is basically an imperialistic mission, but accepting the fact that Napoleon is there, there's this revolt against his administration. Napoleon pushes back. There's a certain point at which combating this revolt becomes a straight-up massacre of the people of the city, and that's definitely what happened here.
They had come to bring enlightenment to Egypt, yet Napoleon is increasingly descending into darkness.
Well, Napoleon was never one to sort of offer you the option to take this or take that. If he wanted to enlighten you, enlighten your country, he would force it down your throat. We have many examples of Napoleon doing this, even if from Napoleon's perspective he was doing a good thing, introducing modernity, enlightenment. Well, he would do it by force if he had to.
Would you like to see the final episode of this series right after watching this one? Well, now with Nebula first, you totally can. Ooh, and stick around for a teaser of Ep 5 after this episode. But hold on, we're getting ahead of ourselves. The revolt of Cairo occurred due to a number of complicated factors, but some of the most obvious were Napoleon's attempt to remake Egyptian society along a French Enlightenment model. The religious equality laws of the French Republic, for example, lifted prohibitions on non-Muslims, thus allowing Christians and Jews to wear turbans, carry swords, and ride horses.
I think a couple of things went wrong. I think first off, there's this sort of forceful introduction of French Enlightenment ideas that didn't necessarily gel with the society that was already there. I think another big issue is that despite Napoleon trying to relate to the local population, trying to portray himself as this defender and protector of Islam, at the end of the day, they just didn't trust him, they didn't believe it, and I think there was a big gap between Napoleon and the people of the region. I mean, first off, a lot of the French officers, a lot of the French soldiers were not a fan of Cairo. They found it very disappointing compared to what they were imagining. They weren't a fan of the culture. A lot of them didn't particularly like Islam or the Muslims there, so there was that gap. Oftentimes, if you read the reports or the writings of these French officers or these French troops, they were pretty disparaging about Egypt as a whole. And Napoleon, even though he tried to be magnanimous and relate to the people, relate to the imams, he just struggled to really do it. I mean, on the most fundamental level, there was this communication gap, right? We talked about in earlier episodes that Napoleon used translators, including Maltese translators, who couldn't really get the Arabic exactly right, or had this sort of muddled Maltese version of the language, and so from him arriving, the communication was sort of difficult. And I just think a lot of people were pretty skeptical about the aims of Napoleon, pretty fairly. And so all of these things combined just did not result in the sort of harmonious relationship that Napoleon was hoping for.
Similarly, women were allowed to go unveiled. And the sight of barefaced Egyptian women attending parties and drinking wine with French officers, including some high-class former wives of Mamelukes and daughters of prominent families, raised fury. French soldiers also forced themselves on local women with regularity, sometimes even forming gangs to break into harems in scenes of mass assault. Also, Napoleon's attempt to architecturally transform Cairo with streetlights and carriage routes ran roughshod over local people, as engineers demolished saints' tombs and mosques to widen the streets so they could accommodate carriages. In addition, the neighborhood gates they destroyed in order to aid policing actually caused a crime wave, since thieves and gangs now had easy access. But the Egyptian chronicler and diarist, Abdul Rahman al-Jabarti, to whom we owe most of our understanding of the Egyptian side of the French occupation, claimed that the true cause of the revolt was political. Napoleon's institution of heavy property taxes, usually collected by Coptic Christians and brutally enforced by French troops, were the largest factor.
Right. And so we talked about this last time. This, I think, is a combination of material and cultural factors. Now, of course, materially, people don't want to be taxed, right? And they especially don't want those taxes to be enforced violently and strongly. Secondarily, as they mentioned there, oftentimes a lot of this administration was done by these Egyptian Copts, Christians, and or Europeans who Napoleon was employing as part of his administration, not to mention that a lot of these new taxes, especially these property taxes, traditionally would not have been levied on Muslims. They might have been levied on non-Muslims, but now Napoleon was saying, hey, equal taxation, we're going to be applying these evenly. And to him, that might have sounded great. But to the local people of the region, it was a big, big insult. And that's why I say there's sort of a combination of these cultural and material factors.
Even so, not every district in Cairo rose, and many prominent citizens, like al-Jabarti, considered the rebellion foolish given French military strength.
Yeah, and I mentioned this last time. You know, when the revolt was occurring, some of the imams preached peace, for either peace itself or because they were worried about a French backlash. But some of the imams did rile the people up, get them ready for this sort of revolt against French leadership. A lot of the local elites sort of took a more detached approach, as in they weren't necessarily willing to support this revolt, they weren't willing to get in the streets, but they also were not willing to associate with Napoleon, they didn't attend his dinners, they didn't want to have that sort of association, so they sort of kept out of it.
And he was right. For Napoleon had crushed the rebels with extreme violence. In addition to the mass executions of rebel holdouts, he employed torture to discover ringleaders and torched villages that participated. And the French referred to these rebels with a linguistic term, insurgents, that would become a permanent fixture of the Western military lexicon. But for all of his brutality, Napoleon knew he could not afford to be indiscriminate in his campaign.
I mean, to be fair, if anyone in Europe had experience with this sort of, counterinsurgency, it would be the French. I mean, think about the French revolutionary experience. They've been fighting against, the countries that surround them for years, but they've also been fighting internally, fending off these counter-revolutionary movements. And so, hey, if anyone was ready for this type of thing, it was definitely the French Revolutionary Army.
If he killed every influential person that had participated, all of Cairo would rise, and he couldn't defeat a population of 600,000. So calling in his Grand Council of Clerics, men he'd hoped to lead Egypt for him, he first made them swear that they hadn't been aware of the rising, then pressured them into issuing a statement that he'd written. This statement blamed the revolt on outside forces, causing discord between the French and Egyptians, while at the same time lionizing Napoleon in his usual propagandistic style. The beneficent and invisible hand of God, it read, came to calm the sedition. By the council's intercession with the commander-in-chief Bonaparte, the evils that would have ensued were averted. He prevented the troops from burning the city and from pillaging, for he is full of wisdom, beneficent, and merciful toward the Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, this is just basic Napoleonic propaganda. This is what he did everywhere. Napoleon was pretty good at making himself look impressive despite the situation. And to be fair, usually he was pretty impressive. I imagine in this instance it was probably a lot less convincing.
He is the particular protector of the poor, and without him, all of the inhabitants of Cairo would no longer exist. Yeah, see, despite stamping out an open resistance in Cairo, Napoleon was still deeply insecure, both personally and militarily.
He was militarily a bit insecure. I don't know if Napoleon was personally insecure. I mean, he was extremely egotistical, I'll say that much. He thought of himself extremely highly, but I don't necessarily know if it was insecurity that led him to this.
On the military front, his generals had finally pushed Murad Bey out of Upper Egypt, but not before he'd received terrible news from the Ottoman Sultan Selim III. French diplomats had flooded the Ottoman court, trying to convince Selim to recognize French rule over Egypt in exchange for rice shipments. Instead, the Sultan had joined an alliance with Britain and Russia, forming a second coalition against France.
Yeah, it feels worthwhile to give a little bit of background on this. So, France and the Ottoman Empire actually had a fairly long-standing alliance. You know, the French and the Ottomans were allies. And so, we haven't mentioned this so far, but that's another aspect you could think about when you think about Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. When he was planning it out, when he was consulting with other people, the French had this, frankly deluded idea that, well, we are allies with the Ottomans, and we are invading their territory, but this is territory that the Ottomans basically don't even control, and they've had a lot of issues with the Mamluks anyway, so why don't we invade? And they won't be that upset, and we can, maybe pay them off or pay for the territory if they are, and, problem will be solved. Obviously, that didn't happen at all. The Ottomans saw this as a massive insult, a massive threat to their territorial integrity, and so they fought back, and we're going to see that in this episode. They were extremely upset with the French, and so they sided against them. They allied with the British. So the French really did not understand the Ottoman mindset or what the Ottoman Empire would actually do if they went forward with this expedition.
And had declared a jihad against French forces in Egypt.
Right, and not to pause again so quickly, but this is another thing that's worth talking about. So the Ottoman Sultan, in his position as Caliph, of course that's broader than just being Sultan. Caliph covers the entire Islamic world. Now, in contrast to times past, the Ottoman Sultan's authority was not as absolute as that of some of the early caliphs of the Caliphate, but the Ottoman Sultan did still hold some of that political and religious authority, and like they said, he ordered any faithful Muslims to resist this French occupation. That was also a big issue for Napoleon and the French in trying to bring the Egyptians to their side. Napoleon portraying himself as a defender of Islam, trying to get the local imams on his side, when the Ottoman Sultan had told all faithful Muslims to resist. So this caused a lot of issues for the French.
So just as Murad Bey was on the ropes, foreign jihadis from Arabia and Syria began to reinforce his ranks. Likewise, the Ottoman governor of Acre, who gained the title of the Butcher for his excellence in pursuing rebels on the Ottomans' behalf, not only rebuffed Napoleon's attempt to get him to switch sides, but accepted British aid.
Yeah, Jazar Pasha is one of those fairly typical characters that you find in this style of government. The Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, this sort of court government. He was this very talented yet cynical politician type. His nickname was the Butcher, the kind of guy who's great at those sort of backdoor dealings, very efficient and rises up to the top in this situation.
Meanwhile, rumors flew that France was about to go to war with its neighbors again. French troops, already deeply unhappy in Egypt, began to fear that their homeland was at risk while they were stranded in a losing colonial venture. And none were more frightened than Bonaparte. Should France be invaded, he would need to be there to defend it and advance his position. And just as it seemed things couldn't get any worse, he received news that the Ottomans were planning a two-pronged assault on Egypt.
And there we go. I was talking about how the Ottomans are going to fight back, and now they really are fighting back. They're putting boots on the ground.
First would marshal at Acre and cross the desert, with another landing near Alexandria. Napoleon acted at once, hoping that if he moved fast enough, he could take Acre and turn back the first force before circling back to defeat the second. So marshaling his army, including an experimental unit of camel-mounted cavalry, he pushed his troops on another punishing march across the desert. The first towns fell easily. Then came the port of Jaffa, which responded to Napoleon's request to surrender by decapitating the French messenger and displaying his head on the wall. Angered at the city's resistance.
Okay, and let's think about what we know about Napoleon. We've literally talked about it in this video. What happens when you resist Napoleon, especially in a way like that? Do you guys think that Napoleon's going to be merciful to this city? Or do you think he's going to take some violent and cruel action? You know, you can vote down below, but I think we all know what's about to happen.
When his troops finally breached the walls on March 7th, he allowed them to sack the city for 2 days, initiating scenes of pillaging, torture, and sexual assault.
And killing, of course.
At the culmination, he ordered 3,000 captured Ottoman soldiers to be led to the beach,
Yep.
where soldiers systematically murdered them with volleys, bayonets, and cavalry charges.
Another massacre.
The horror of the sack upset more of his own officers, one of whom admitted they would not have performed such mass executions on a European enemy. Napoleon's intent was to terrify the Acre garrison into surrendering, and it did not work. British engineers had reinforced the city's 8-foot-thick medieval walls with earthen slopes to deflect cannon shot. In truth, the siege was over before it began. The British Navy captured the ships carrying the French siege artillery, making the walls impossible to breach, but Bonaparte still threw men at the defenses for 60 days.
Yeah, so now we get to Acre. This is a pretty big L for Napoleon. As they mentioned, the Brits, who remember, they had basically complete control over the Mediterranean at this point, managed to capture a bunch of the French artillery. So that was a massive, massive loss even before the bombardment began. Remember, this is basically an Anglo-Ottoman force. They had reinforced the city. Acre was in a very strong position. It could be resupplied by the Anglo-Ottoman Navy. So Napoleon, this was going to be a struggle from the start, but he continued to throw himself at this challenge.
Despite utterly defeating the Ottoman army sent to reinforce the city
Right.
and ultimately invade Egypt, Acre itself seemed impregnable.
And you know what? There was actually a French officer, an émigré, and for those that don't know, an émigré in this context was a Frenchman who had fled from the revolution. Oftentimes they were aristocrats. There was a Frenchman at Acre serving there who had been a bit of a rival of Napoleon's at military school. So, there you go.
Then, twin disasters struck. First, a bubonic plague outbreak struck the French camp, and second, a British officer sent newspapers across the line informing Napoleon that France was at war with the Second Coalition and had already suffered massive losses in Germany and Italy.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this last time, but remember how the Brits controlling the Mediterranean cut Napoleon off from a lot of information, and so any information that got back to him because the British wanted it to get back to him. And in terms of the plague, plague had already been going around. A lot of plague had actually been picked up from Jaffa, and of course it had only gotten worse as they continued to march. It had spread throughout the French army, and so, of course there were a lot of French soldiers who had died or been wounded in fighting, but honestly, just as bad was the plague that was going around. That was really weakening the French forces.
Napoleon cut his losses and ended his Syrian campaign. Later, while in exile, he would recall that he dreamed of making Acre a home base for pushing into India to found an Asian empire, succeeding where Alexander had failed.
Well, yeah, we talked about this in the first episode, but one of Napoleon's ambitions throughout this whole thing was succeeding, in the paths of those like Alexander. Those ancient heroes, your Alexanders, your Julius Caesars, but I think Alexander in particular held Napoleon's interest. He wanted to do what Alexander had done and maybe even go one step further. I don't know. How about that? And it's also worth pointing out, I think, the efforts of British naval commander Sidney Smith, who played a big role in reinforcing the garrison at Acre, sending in supplies, bolstering it. He played a big role in that.
He had visions, he said, of riding east on an elephant, a turban on his head, and carrying a new version of the Quran, which he'd rewrite to suit his purposes. And maybe he would have founded his own religion. He'd even taken small steps on that path, releasing statements hinting that he was the Mahdi, a messianic figure in folk Islam, said to bring justice at the end times. These odd pronouncements claimed he could read minds to discover traitors and rebels, and that God had sent him to directly destroy the Mamelukes, papists, and bring Egypt back to its antique glory.
Yeah, okay, what I'll say, they're kind of presenting Napoleon like he's going a little bit crazy at this point. What I'll say is that, yes, Napoleon had an extremely high opinion of himself. He was extremely egotistical, but most of this is propaganda. Now, the thing with Napoleon is that sometimes it does get difficult to distinguish what he's just peddling as propaganda and what he actually believes about himself. I think especially if we look early in Napoleon's career, say his campaign in Italy, he talks of himself as this great conqueror, and I think at a certain point, not only was that propaganda, but he began to believe that about himself. I mean, he clearly believes it about himself here. But I think the more fantastical or religious stuff is more propaganda than it is true, sincere belief. Now, yeah, Napoleon could get kind of out there with his view of himself, but I do think he was a practical and fairly secular guy.
Real cult leader energy going on there. But that Asian empire was only a bitter dream when the army of the Orient turned back towards Egypt, walking across the desert because they'd eaten most of their horses during the siege. Bonaparte walked too, though occasionally he rode a camel. At times, he quietly ordered that plague victims, no longer able to travel and sure to die, be euthanized with opium so the pursuing Bedouin would not torture them.
Yeah, okay, so this is an unconfirmed claim. First off, they said at times. We have one report that Napoleon had ordered plague victims to be euthanized. It's unconfirmed, so we don't know if it's true. It may be, but we don't know. Right? So keep that in your minds. This absolutely may not be true. And then, I guess we're not going to talk about it, but there's a very famous scene at Jaffa, very propagandized, I should say, where Napoleon visited the plague ward at Jaffa to basically spend time with the plague victims. He even touched them, which of course was seen as a pretty crazy thing, showing his confidence in himself and sort of hearkening back to the medieval kings of old. There was this idea back in the day that medieval kings had this touch that could cure illness, and so if they touched you, you might get better. And though, Napoleon might not say that was the kind of thing he was doing, the amount of propaganda that exploded from that event, I really think his visit to the quarantine ward in Jaffa is probably one of the more famous points of this campaign, so I'm sort of surprised they didn't talk about it. There was all this writing and paintings and all that sort of stuff to portray Napoleon sort of on the light end just as a caring commander who goes and sees if his men are okay, and then on the sort of heavier end, maybe hearkening back to those medieval kings with their religious powers. Once again, it's all propaganda. But, that is something that occurred in relation to the plague, and then this, where Napoleon may have ordered some of his men to be killed, some of the plague victims, we don't know if that's true.
Though despite that grim march, he did return to Cairo in a triumphal procession, declaring victory in turning back the Ottoman army that had tried to come to Acre. Then within weeks, when the Second Ottoman force landed near Alexandria, he routed them in what was more of a massacre than a true battle. Yet even despite that last victory, Bonaparte now knew the French Republic of Egypt had no future. There was really no chance of holding it, and
I'm assuming by that last battle they're talking about the battle at Abu Qir Bay, I believe. They're a little vague with the naming of the timeline sometimes. But that was a pretty big victory for Napoleon, and it sort of allowed him to twist the narrative a little bit, because, let's be honest, that whole march up to Syria to take Jaffa and Acre really ended up not going so well. A lot of his men died from plague, the siege of Acre failed, and he had to march his ass back to Cairo. So having this big victory at Abu Qir Bay, which is where, if you remember, the French had lost the Battle of the Nile, was something that Napoleon could twist into a lot of positive propaganda. Like, look, we have this great victory, great victory. It was also a big moment for Murat, who would in the future, of course, be Marshal Murat, the cavalry commander. He played a pretty big role in that battle, so it was a big moment for his reputation and sort of the reputation of the French cavalry overall.
The propaganda value of his great conquest would never be higher than it was right now. Only gradual defeat awaited the army here.
Yeah, I think that's true. Things probably weren't going to get better, and the Battle of Aboukir, not Aboukir Bay, the Battle of Aboukir was something that Napoleon could at least tout as a win as he was leaving.
And, he'd really prefer others be blamed for that. But still, he did have duties in Egypt, and no orders to return to France. So, he did the only responsible thing a leader in his position could ever do. Told his generals he was carrying out a countrywide inspection, quietly boarded a ship, and ditched them. Leave.
Yeah. Well, I'll let them finish.
General Kleber only a letter saying, essentially, "Hey, you're in charge now, pal. Good luck. You're gonna need it." Now, you might be wondering how that decision worked out for, say, Napoleon, Egypt.
Yes, and I'm gonna avoid the... Yeah, okay, we can watch the next episode. We don't need a teaser. Okay, so let's talk about that. Right? So, Napoleon left. And we'll get another chance to talk about this next time. He's gotten a lot of criticism for that decision. And you can understand why. What I will say first off is that Napoleon intended to meet with Kleber before he left, but Kleber didn't make it to the meeting, and so Napoleon continued, just leaving him a note behind. So I will say he did intend to tell Kleber in person, but ended up not. And he only informed a small group of people, most of which he took with him. So it was a surprise to Kleber, which was kind of whack. Maybe it would have been better if he'd been a little more upfront. But this is often seen as an extremely cowardly move. A lot of people criticize Napoleon for this, and I understand why, and I think there is criticism to be levied. But what I will say is that, Napoleon felt like there wasn't much more to be gained from Egypt, and that it would be more beneficial for France and for him to go back to the homeland and defend France. And also, of course, bolster his own career. I mean, that's what he did when he got back to France. I mean, after this point, we're going to a real important part of Napoleon's career. Egypt doesn't end up doing super well after Napoleon leaves. And I think some of that blame has to go on him. But we'll talk about that next time. I don't want to get into it too much right now. I mean, Napoleon also brought Berthier, Murat, Lannes, and Marmont with him. So he brought some of the army's top talent away from Egypt, where they very much could have been needed, but he needed them more with him. So, I think it's a little more mixed than people make it out to be. People are real negative about this decision from Napoleon. I think if you're going to blame him for anything, instead of specifically blaming him for leaving at that point, I would honestly blame him for the entire expedition as a whole. I really think, it didn't end up being super successful. There were some successes. There were some failures. I don't think it was a fantastic use of resource or manpower. So I think, if you're going to blame Napoleon, you can absolutely blame him for leaving, but it's probably more fair to blame him for the whole thing overall. Starting this thing, going about it the way he did, and then leaving the way he did. The whole thing sort of fits under the same umbrella, in my opinion. But anyway, I think we'll have a chance to sort of relitigate this next episode. I imagine they're going to talk about Napoleon leaving a little bit more. So hey, if you have any opinions, feel free to leave them down below. I'm always curious to leave to read your comments. If you guys enjoyed this one, I would appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.